All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for your love for us. And thank you that we can, you've revealed yourself to us and we can participate with you in what you're doing. We ask now for your presence in our thoughts and our words as we look at the world in which you sent your son, the world in which you have your people, and in which all this was carried out and on the stage of the world. Help us use this to better sense what it was like, what the context was for these events and the words that were there. We want to draw closer to you, and part of what we do that, and one of the ways we do that is to look at where you have revealed yourself to be. So we ask your guidance, your help, inspire us, encourage us. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 All right, then I will share my screen. We will see my slides here. The Holy Land, a preview. We're going to take a trip to the Holy Land, but first we need to find out where it is. So we'll begin with an overview. So where in the world are we? Let's see, click here. All right, this a satellite view. The land of Israel is circled in the middle. As you can see, it's almost surrounded by deserts. Those light brown, those tan parts of the picture. The Holy Land is just a small strip of dull green squeezed in between the sea and the desert. So we'll zoom in for a closer look. And then a little bit closer again, thanks to Google Earth. But we still get closer and we see that we're still surrounded by desert. The land of Israel, the southern part of it is just desert. It's tan. The northern part is kind of a dull gray, green, a little bit of vegetation. Let's see where the, oops. Nope, that's not going to work. Okay, I'll stop that and we'll look at a different screen where I can, I think I just put the wrong slide anyway. Anyway, that is the land of Israel, the Sea of Galilee. Let's see, all right, share that screen again. Sea of Galilee is up in the north. Annotate, mouse. So it's up in the north and the Dead Sea is kind of in the center, the Salt Sea, Mediterranean on the left. Jerusalem is approximately this darker green area near the center. So that gives you a little bit of feel for where we are. Now, historians talk about like 6 major civilizations of the ancient world. The Mayans, Oltecs in Central America, the Incas in South America, Egypt, the Nile River, Egypt, Mesopotamia, area of Sumer and Babylon, the Indus River Valley civilization, which is now Pakistan, and northeastern China, the Yangtze River. Each of these civilizations developed independently. And we might wonder, well, why didn't God put his people into part of the civilized world? What we saw earlier, the Holy Land seems like kind of an insignificant place. If God was going to do something great, why not do it in an area that had rich soil and well-watered land? Why would he start in this dry, kind of semi-desert land? Paul says that God sent Jesus in the fullness of time. That's Galatians 4:4. He sent Jesus at the right time. And I think he sent him to the right place too. If the story had taken place in a jungle or on a tropical island, the story would have been different. Might not have even happened at all. God wanted the story to take place in a place like this land of Israel. So not in the middle of a great civilization. God's people needed to be on the margins because they needed to be distinct from the surrounding culture, but close enough to be in touch with it. If God had called people in China, they would have been absorbed by China. It would be difficult to be a distinct people surrounded by a huge culture like that. God's people needed a small land of their own, a land that wasn't surrounded by a bigger culture. And when the Son of God became a human being, he didn't come as a part of the ruling elite or as a wealthy person. He came as an ordinary working person. And in the same way, he didn't come into a great and powerful people, but into a small, relatively powerless, and sometimes despised group of people. Most of the big civilizations were based on good farmland, flat land, and that favored the formation of large nations. The land was fertile, which meant that parts of the population didn't have to farm. They could devote their creative energies into something other than farming, like developing writing, metalworking, building projects, and things like that. Now, you might notice from the map that most of these 6 civilizations were isolated from each other by mountains, deserts, or oceans. Mountains made it difficult to go from China to the Indus River, and a desert lay between the Indus River and Mesopotamia. But trade and travel did develop, particularly between Mesopotamia and Egypt. There were some cross-cultural exchanges and occasional wars too. And the people of Israel ended up between the 2 great powers of the era. Now we can zoom in and see the travel route between Mesopotamia and Egypt. As you can see from this satellite view, it's mostly desert if you go straight across. But if the people travel upriver, up the Euphrates River from Babylon, they can follow the river upwards until they finally get to an area of dark green, kind of near the Mediterranean coast. That dark green means there's enough vegetation and enough moisture to resupply the caravans. And then they could go south through that area, across a small stretch of desert, and then across the Holy Land in order to get to Egypt. So they could, some people have called this the Fertile Crescent. Parts of it weren't especially fertile, but it got that name anyway. But at least there's some food production along the way and water is available. Travel was possible, even fairly frequent between these 2 great river civilizations. They were far enough apart to be distinct, but close enough for some cultural exchanges and a few wars. In this setting, in between these 2 great powers, the children of Israel developed their own culture. The area they were in had mountains and valleys with lots of natural barriers, and that favored the formation of small nations. They were distant enough from the great powers that they could have their own culture, but they were close enough to those powers that the powers could sometimes invade and rule. The people were supposed to trust in God for their rain in a land where rain wasn't always reliable, and for their security in a land that wasn't always secure. Now, God put them in a marginal situation on purpose to test them, to demonstrate his blessings and their reactions to his blessings. In history, Egypt dominated part of the time. Mesopotamia, Babylon, and Assyria dominated at other times. And eventually, new powers came from the northwest, Greece, and then Rome. And they ruled the land of Israel for a time. And that led to Jesus being killed by this cooperation of Jewish religious authorities and Gentile rulers. And in effect, all ethnic groups are implicated in his death, and all are saved by his death. The story isn't just about one little nation or about one great civilization. The story involves all peoples spread over a very large area. reflecting the fact that the story is indeed for all civilizations. And since the story took place within a large empire, the story could spread far and wide using the resources of the Roman Empire, the Roman roads, travel that was made possible by that empire. So it turns out to be a good thing that the gospel developed in a small place within a big empire. So the nation of Israel was on this land bridge between one great civilization to another. But most of the time, Israel did not live on the main road. So we can see the topography of the land of Israel here. The travel routes marked here in red tended to avoid difficult terrain. That just makes sense. There's no need to go over a mountain when you could go down a valley. So they went around mountainous areas. They avoided steep canyons. If a caravan went from Mesopotamia in the east to Egypt on the west, it would most likely pass through Damascus, which I show up here in the upper right-hand corner. And then they couldn't go along the coast of Lebanon, because the mountains there go right next to the sea, and there's not a very good place to build a road there. So they had to go through parts of the Holy Land. From Damascus, they had two main choices to go south. First option was to go west to the Israelite city of Dan, and then south to the Sea of Galilee, past the city of Capernaum. Then they angled over these low hills in Galilee through a mountain pass at Megiddo, then south on the coastal plain to Gaza. And parts of the northern part of that coastal plain, there's kind of swampy lands near the coast. So they avoided those and they went further east, closer to the foothills. But once they got further south to the area of the Philistines, they could travel all along the coast all the way to Egypt. And this is often called the International Coastal Highway. But don't think of it as a highway, really. It wasn't paved. It was just a dirt path, and wide enough for one donkey cart to pass another donkey cart, or two lines of camels to pass each other. Now, I mentioned Megiddo because there were several battles for control of Megiddo. Both Egypt and Assyria tried to control that pass because it was such an important bottleneck on the travel route. And I mentioned that the highway went past Capernaum too. And that's, of course, the city that Jesus spent a lot of time in. And because this travel route went through Capernaum, it had lots of different kinds of people in it: tax collectors, soldiers, fishers, farmers, stonemasons, builders, bakers, innkeepers, whatever a diverse economy would have. Now, the other option for the travel route would be go south from Damascus, mainly through the desert. They'd have to avoid some of these difficult canyons that were east of the Dead Sea. So they traveled mostly through the desert from one oasis to another. And if they go far enough south, then they could join some other caravans coming up the coast of Arabia, going to Egypt. It was a difficult route, much drier, but perhaps better in winter when more water was available and it was a bit cooler in the desert. But most of the travel seemed to have gone along the western route through Galilee and along the coast. So Jerusalem was in the mountains. It was off the main road. So although Jerusalem had, Judea had some struggles with the the Philistines to the west, it was easy for Judeans to stay isolated from the rest of the world, stay isolated from the enemy powers. Samaria was a bit closer to the highway. Galilee was on it. And that helps explain why Samaria and Galilee had more foreign influences and why in the Old Testament they were conquered before Jerusalem was. Now, the Holy Land is kind of a small place. It's 150 miles, of inhabited area from Dan in the south to Beersheba. No, Beersheba is in the south, Dan's in the north. It has a diverse topography. It's sometimes described as all the variety of California squeezed into an area the size of New Jersey. And it can be divided into 4 main regions, basic geographic areas that are similar, have similarities with each other there. Each of them run north and south. That's how the topography tends to go. First, we can see there the coastal plain is on the left, next to the Mediterranean Sea. It's wide in the south, the area where the Philistines lived, and gradually it narrows to the plain of Sharon. That's the area that used to be marshland, full of mosquitoes, clogged with vegetation. So people tended to avoid it. It was a sparsely populated area. Now it is heavily populated because the Israelis drained those swamps. They had a little bit better agricultural technology than they did in the ancient world. So they drained the swamps, and it's a fertile area, and lots of people live there. That is where the Tel Aviv, the largest city, is. Now, this coastal plain is interrupted near the north by a little spur of the mountains that jut out to the northwest. That's Mount Carmel. And then a smaller coastal plain is north of that. The second area is called the Central Mountains. That runs from Beersheba in the south up to to Jerusalem, the area of Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, Shechem, Samaria. This area is where a lot of the Old Testament history happened. And now, due to the kind of rocks that are there, it eroded in such a way that the valleys are very steep and not a very good way to travel. People traveled along the ridges to get up and down, and that wasn't very good either. So it wasn't really easy for other people to get into this area. Further north, Manasseh and Ephraim, the central area, which was the center of the kingdom of Israel. The rocks are a bit softer there, the valleys are wider, and things are more accessible. Now, I mentioned Mount Carmel earlier. That's a spur on the north, and that is where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal, and that's where the pass at Megiddo is, and where the travel route goes through this mountainous area. Now, north of this, there's a center area here called the Jezreel Valley. It doesn't really fit in any of the areas. It's low-lying land. It's a good fertile land. It just has kind of maybe it's its 5th region. North of that is Galilee. Lower Galilee is in the south. It is lower in terms of elevation too. The mountains are not as tall. Upper Galilee is all the way at the north. It is really rugged, a very difficult place to build roads, and not a very heavily populated area either. Now, historically, the ancient Israelites lived mostly in the mountainous areas. They had trouble conquering low-lying areas. In the area of the Philistines, the Philistines defeated them militarily. So the Israelites tended to stay in the mountains. They didn't have horses and chariots, but the people in the low-lying areas did. And horses and chariots work far more effectively in these flatlands than they do in the mountains. It's interesting, in modern Israel, the situation is almost the reverse. Most of the Jews live in the flatlands, and it's the Palestinians who live in the mountainous areas. All right, the third area I've marked here in blue, it's called the Jordan Valley, or the geologists call it the Great Rift Valley. It's a big trough in the shape of the earth. It runs from here, goes all the way to Turkey, and it runs down through the Red Sea, through Ethiopia, Tanzania. It's a big area of earth activity, earthquakes. So Israel does have earthquakes, and some cities have been destroyed by earthquakes, but it has also left its mark in these landforms. And in this area is where two parts of the earth are kind of splitting apart and leaving a very deep valley in between. So a lot of the Jordan River Valley is below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. The Dead Sea is 1,400 feet below sea level. It's the shores of the Dead Sea are the lowest dry land on earth. All right, last, fourth major region, called the Eastern Mountains, sometimes called the Transjordanian Mountains, the mountains on the other side of the Jordan. They're about the same height as the Central Mountains, and some places a little taller, some places less. And they are important and for a lot of Old Testament events, but they play very little role in the New Testament. East of those mountains is just a desert where there's a few nomads, Arabic Bedouin, but no settlements. They're all nomads. So that's kind of an overview of the physical land itself. But the land also shapes something that's very important for the people too, and that is climate, particularly rainfall. The world of the Bible was greatly affected by the rainfall. Now, the prevailing winds here tend to come from the west, from the Mediterranean Sea, and they come primarily in winter. They get cool, wet winters, hot, dry summers. It's a lot like Southern California. Well, in Southern California, we have what is called a Mediterranean climate. A few other west coasts around the world have a similar climate, part of Chile, some southwest part of Australia, Southwest Africa. And in all these areas, all the rain comes in 5 months in winter, and there's 7 months with no rain at all. Now, there are two kind of general rules for how rainfall happens in the Holy Land. Well, one is it's in winter. There's a kind of a peak in early winter and then another peak in later winter, but it's a lot like what we have here. You can have rain at any time. So we're traveling to Israel in winter, so we're more likely to be in some rain. Now, the southern areas have more desert, so the rain increases as you go further north. And as you go higher elevation, the rain also increases. Like in the Negev desert in the south, the west winds are coming off of the Sahara Desert. So they have very little moisture. There's nothing, they don't have any moisture to drop. So the southern desert there is basically an extension of the Sahara Desert. But as we go further north, the prevailing winds are coming off the sea, so they have more moisture. And as they go east, they encounter these central mountains, the air rises, it cools, and that causes precipitation. Now, east of the central mountains in the Jordan Valley, there's kind of a big trough there, and that's called a rain shadow, where there's very little rainfalls. The area of southern Jordan Valley only gets a couple inches a year of rainfall. But once the air travels further east to the next row of mountains, then it rises and cools and causes some more rainfall. So even though some of these areas are right on the edge of the desert, because they are in mountainous areas, the mountains trap some of the moisture for them, and it can funnel it toward the different canyons where they could be dammed up or the water stored in some way. Now, some of these areas, like between the area of Judah and the Jordan Valley, That's called the wilderness of Judah. It's one of the most desolate looking places. Not only doesn't get much rain, the rocks there just don't hold water very well. It just rolls off and it's gone. The next slide shows a map of rainfall amounts. In the south, very far south, it's tan, where they get less than 8 inches of rain a year, and that's too little to have any kind of agriculture. This yellow band, that's where Beersheba starts. That's 8 inches a year, and an average of 8, and that's just enough to grow a small grain crop. But that's only in an average year. Some years are going to be more than that, some years less. So some years you're going to have a crop failure. So it's not really a good place to grow crops. It's a good place for flocks of sheep that can be moved around according to where the grass might be. If you move a little further north, you start getting into higher mountains. Hebron has this green area, and that's where they have more reliable agriculture for winter wheat, barley, olives, grapes, and those things. In this green area, there's around Hebron, Jerusalem. Further north is Samaria. Now, if you go way further north into Galilee, you'll get into even blue, where there is a much more rainfall on the Mount Hermon, highest point in Israel. They have purple there. It's kind of like a rainforest amount of rain, but it's so steep that you can't farm there. But it does, all that rain sinks into the rocks and comes out as springs that feed the Jordan River. So all that rain is useful. Now, even and in some places along the coast, especially, dew is a very important part of the moisture that they get. Some have calculated that, like on Mount Carmel, gets so much dew, it amounts to about 7 inches of rain a year. That's about the equivalent of that. Now, when the Israelites first moved into the land is about the same time as they had invented cisterns to store some of the water. They would dig a hole in a rock, and then the rocks were porous. They were limestone, so they wouldn't normally hold water. But about that time, they invented a plaster, a lime plaster that could waterproof the caverns. So they could store water in these cisterns for the dry part of the year. It wouldn't be enough water to irrigate all their crops, but it would be enough water for the people. The crops grew mainly in, they would plant in fall, have rains basically after the Feast of Tabernacles. The rains would then help the wheat sprout. It would grow all winter long. And then once the weather turned dry in spring is when they would be harvesting the wheat between the festival of Passover and the festival of Pentecost. Those were harvest festivals. So they had, springs were an important part of the location of cities. In many of these drier parts of the country, they would situate cities only where there were springs, where they had a plentiful supply of water. Jericho is at a spring. Jerusalem is at a spring. Even though it gets rainfall as the top of a mountain, it was very helpful that it also had a year-round spring. In Jerusalem's case, it was called the Gihon Spring. And that made it possible for the cities to continue there even in dry season. Now, in general, agriculture does better in the north. Pasture land does better in the south. But even in the north, there were lots of mountainous areas that were too steep for agriculture, so they would have flocks and herds even in those steeper areas, and olive groves, grapes, grapevines that grew throughout the country. So those were some of the major crops that the climate could have. The land of Israel has very few mineral resources. There was no iron ore, no copper mines, except way down in the south in the Sinai Desert. So Israel was kind of poor in that resource. The Dead Sea had a few minerals in it, but it was a very difficult place to work. You'd have to pack in all your water. So now God did describe it as the land flowing with milk and honey. But that's a figure of speech. It takes a lot of work for either milk or honey to flow. And milk, is what we generally know of. The honey, their word for honey also included a paste made out of dates. We can get sugar from dates, but they turned it into a paste, and that was called honey as well. So that might have been the part of the milk and honey that the land was known for. The land did export some wheat, wine, honey, oil, but it also had droughts, often severe droughts. The taxes were based on the good years. They were sometimes reduced in a drought year, but not always. And so poor people would be vulnerable to that. And sometimes in bad years, they'd have to sell their land or sometimes even sell themselves into slavery. Basically, the land of Judea was economically marginal. It wasn't a high priority on anybody's conquest list. Usually the enemy empires invaded the mountains only after the mountains had bothered them. Whenever the Jews came down to interfere in other areas, then that's when they would go up into the mountains and try to take care of these troublemakers. As one writer says, international invaders rarely entered the Central Mountains due to its reduced economic value and rugged terrain. These empires had chariots, and the chariots just didn't work very well in mountains. But the area did attract empires because of its strategic location on this strip of land that the empires would use to get to Egypt. In the days of David and Solomon, Israel did become kind of wealthy, but it wasn't so much from their own resources or agriculture. It was because they controlled the trade routes back and forth. They could tax these caravans going between Mesopotamia and Egypt. But they could do that only when Egypt and Mesopotamian powers were kind of weak, distracted by internal troubles. And that's what happened in the days of David and Solomon. So the story of Israel isn't the story of a great nation that could rely on abundant resources. It was a nation that sometimes experienced blessings, agricultural, economic, military, but it also suffered when those blessings were taken away. And like that, it was kind of representative of all humanity. We all have potential for blessings, but on our own, we're likely to fail. So the history of Israel is a story of repeated failures, personal failures among its leaders, spiritual failure of the nation, the inability of the nation to hold its own in a world of armies and empires. The land just didn't have natural resources to enable the people to be a world power. But Israel is not just a story of failure, it's also a story of hope, because God gave them moments of greatness that offered a glimpse of what life could be like. He sent prophets to the people to assure them that this deep-rooted problem would be solved. And when Jesus brought the solution to sin and death, it was in a place where the good news could be taken from there to all the world. So that's kind of end of my overview of the land. We can take a closer look at some of the things we'll be looking at later, but I thought I'd pause now to see if you had any comments or questions on this part.
Just quickly, the map you showed a while ago, you said you Googled it, and it shows the green and the brown. Is it kind of still the same is the weather still the same, or was it better during those days? There's more green.
as far as they can tell, the weather has stayed pretty much the same all along. They can see from tree rings and things like that, the amount of rainfall they've had for in past years. And judging from erosion and things like that, yeah, they figured the climate has stayed pretty much the same since ancient Israel. Okay.
Mike,
Yes, Tom.
just a quick question. Where does Israel get most of its water today? I mean, it doesn't sound like there's like a surplus of water there.
No, there is not a surplus, and there are some tensions regarding water. Most of the water they get is from the Jordan River up in the north, the springs that come out of Mount Hermon, and they come out at the base of the mountain and feed the Jordan River, flowing into the Sea of Galilee. They've also dammed the southern exit of the Sea of Galilee to ensure that the water levels stays about the same. But in a drought year, it does drop, and that has been actually helpful to archaeologists. When the lake level dropped 15 feet, then they could start to see the remains of old harbors and that were in the sea earlier. But they also have numerous reservoirs. Israelis have built a lot of irrigation projects, whether to dam waters up or to pump groundwater out.
Okay.
So yeah, but water is not in that plentiful in most of the country. You'll see abundant water in some places. There are lakes in the valleys up north where they get more rainfall. There's an area that used to be marshland north of the Sea of Galilee. That's in the Jezreel Valley was swampland as well. It just doesn't drain very well. So they created several lakes to help drain the farmland so they could farm it. But yeah, there's water there. But yeah, it is they have a huge project nationwide to bring water down from the north toward the south, where a lot of the people live.
Okay, thank you.
Do they have a record of the population during the time of Jesus in the area?
No, that's based on some guesses, but I do not have a figure with me right now. Yeah, so I don't know. It's not as much as there are people in the land now. Now there are 9 million people in the state of Israel. I don't know whether that includes the Palestinian areas. Sometimes they are kept separate in statistics, and sometimes they are included. But nine some million, there might be another million Palestinians. But in the days of Jesus, I would guess there wasn't any more than 4 million. But even that, I'll try to find out and get back with you on that. Okay. So in the next few weeks, these studies, Wednesday evening studies, we're going to be exploring a few different areas of the Holy Land. And some of us on this Zoom call will actually be going to the Holy Land. And so these Wednesday night studies are designed to give us a preview of what we'll see there. This helps us do our homework to help us, be prepared for what we're going to see. So in our first study, that's today, we're going to look at what we see on the first day of the trip. And then next week, we'll look at what we see on the next day of our trip. So it's basically one study for each day of the trip. Now, Burmy and Jillian are going on a trip in December. Ezra and I are going on a trip in January, and June and Yoli are going in December as well. COVID restrictions permitting, of course. All that's iffy. Our trips are almost exactly the same, but one day is different. And so I'll mention that too. I'll look at the map again and see where we are going. This is day one, Tel Aviv, Yaffo. Yaffo is actually the Hebrew word for Joppa. Arabic name is Jaffa. We're landing that day. And so we're not going to be able to see a lot because we don't have an entire day in order to try to see or to tour and see. And we're also going to be extremely tired because it's severe jet lag on the other side of the world. Day two, we'll travel further north to Caesarea Maritima, the seacoast city that Herod the Great built. Mount Carmel, which is where Elijah had his confrontation with the prophets of Baal. And there's also the city of Megiddo on that same ridge, but a little further away, which is, the book of Revelation talks about Armageddon, which many scholars think refers to the hill of Megiddo. And then we'll go to Nazareth, the city where Jesus grew up. So that's a little cluster of sites for day two. Day three, which is Ezra and I will be going further north to some cities, Old Testament cities of Hatzor and Dan. The tribe of Dan was allotted land down here near Tel Aviv, but they were unable to take it away from the Philistines. So the tribe of Dan just took off wandering north and found somebody else that they could conquer. And so they conquered a city up there and renamed it Dan. This is one of the areas where the springs from Mount Hermon, the springs come out. And so there's abundant water along this area. Dan, Caesarea Philippi is a city that Herod Philip built, named it after Caesar to get favored with Caesar, but he also named it after himself to distinguish it from the previous Caesarea that was on the coast, which built by Herod the Great. That is, the Caesarea Philippi is the area where Jesus asked his disciples, well, who do you think I am? And Peter replied, you are the Christ. And Jesus said, yep, you got that right, but keep it quiet. And there's a little interaction between Jesus and Peter there. They rebuked each other. And Jesus began to explain about what it means to follow him. That day, we'll also go to Har Bintal. Har is the Hebrew name for a mountain. And this is in the Golan Heights. It's an old volcanic mountain, and it has a great overview of all of northern Israel. So hopefully it's not raining that day, and we can see all of northern Israel from our perch up at Har Bintal. Then we go to the city of Katzrin, where there is a well-preserved synagogue from the 6th century. And that gives us a little view as to the Jewish history of the area. So the next day for us and for the December trip, it'll be after Nazareth, will be a cluster of sites around the Sea of Galilee. Now Jesus spent a lot of time around the Sea of Galilee, so we don't have to travel far to occupy an entire day of touring here. There's the city of Capernaum, where it's kind of Jesus' home base at the time. Mount of Beatitudes, traditional site, of course. There's no proof that was the actual location, but the site is an ancient tradition. They looked around for a mountain where it could have worked. And oh, there's one. So they put their name on it, and it's still a tourist attraction. The city of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from. It also has a number of historical sites and churches. Further south, the city of Tiberias. Jesus never went there, but it was the capital city for Herod Antipas. Earlier, he had one north of Nazareth. It was the city of Sepphoris, but later he built a capital city on the Sea of Galilee named Tiberias. But he made the mistake of building his city on top of an old Jewish cemetery. So none of the Jews would live there. But I guess that left it the city to himself. And anyway, he built it. Eventually, though, the Jews came up with some kind of ritual to cleanse the city, and it became a center for rabbinic study. And the Jews later on used Tiberias. After that, we will go south to the city of Beit Shean. It's a very big archaeological site, and that will give us plays a role in the Old Testament. The New Testament name for it was Scythopolis. It was part of the Decapolis, a Gentile city. So it did not play a big role in the Gospels, but it is a great archaeological site. Further south from that, we will look at what's Khazar el Yehud. This is the traditional site of the baptism of Jesus. It's also the traditional site of where the Israelites crossed the Jordan River to go into the land of Israel. And that gives its name there. The Khazar is an Arabic word for tower. The reason they referred to a tower is because there's a very ancient Byzantine church there that has a big tower. The El Yehud is the Arabic word for of Judah. So this was the Tower of Judah. This is the area where the Jews crossed the Jordan River, and later John the Baptist was doing his work, and Jesus was baptized. Now, I suspect that we are only going on the west side, the side controlled by Israel. We're not crossing over the Jordan, because that side is controlled by the nation of Jordan. So anyway, we'll just go down to the river and we'll see it. We can see it from either place. There is also a possible location for a baptism site up closer to the Sea of Galilee, but this one further south is the kind of the traditional one. Then we will go to the city of Jericho, nicknamed the City of Palms. Lots of palm trees there, well watered by several springs. Location of Old Testament history. Joshua and the walls of Jericho fell down, but also New Testament history as well. Jesus passed through there, healed a blind man, and somewhere, I'm not sure which day, we'll go on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, and we'll see some of the rugged terrain that was involved in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The modern road does not follow the old road, but it still goes through some very similar terrain. Then the December tour group will go further south to Qumran, the Dead Sea, the springs at Ein Gedi, and Masada. Qumran is famous for the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. There's a small archaeological site there, very dry desert. The Qumran group, commune, basically, did develop some waterworks to dam up a small stream and channel it to their areas. And so they have many cisterns in which they stored water. But all of the rain they would get is only like a couple inches a year, and it would basically be a flash flood in the canyon. But they had channeled that canyon to divert all the water to where they needed it and where they could store it. The Dead Sea, high percentage of salt. In fact, it's about the highest that's possible. an extremely hot area. You can probably be glad you're going in December. It might be more tolerable then. I don't know whether they'll have you get out and float in the Dead Sea or not. Might depend on time. Ein Gedi are springs that are, and it's a wildlife area, a nature preserve. The springs in the middle of a desert. David did hide out there at one point in his life. So it has some Old Testament history there. Masada is a historical place that's mostly famous for after the New Testament era. This, when the Jews rebelled against the Roman government in year 66, it took a while for the Roman armies to conquer them all. They conquered Jerusalem and destroyed it in year AD 70. But Masada, where some people were holding out, Masada had been developed into a fortress by Herod the Great in a very inaccessible area. Well, we'll read more about that or hear more about that on a later date. But Romans finally did conquer Masada in the year 72. All the Jewish defenders committed suicide rather than being taken captive. Then we're going to have 2 days in Jerusalem. There's just so much to see in Jerusalem. And even with 2 days, we are not going to see a lot of important, good things in Jerusalem. You could probably spend 2 weeks in Jerusalem just seeing the museums, different archaeological sites, things like that. So we are just going to get some of the high priority highlights. So this is a close-up of Jerusalem. You can kind of see it as a gray area. And we will be looking at that's modern Jerusalem as shown by Google Maps. Ancient Jerusalem is a much smaller circle. I think I can point that out. Ancient Jerusalem is in the blue circle there. I put the big rectangle there is the Temple Mount. So I don't think we'll actually be going on to the Temple Mount, but we'll be near it. Starting at the Mount of Olives on the east, we'll get it. It gives us a good, it's 200 feet higher than the Temple Mount. So it's a good overview as we look down into the city of Jerusalem. We look at St. Anne's Church, which is I think it's a 6th century church, but it's near the Via Dolorosa. We'll go to the Davidson Center, which is a big archaeological site at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. And it's still an active archaeological dig. So we'll see some of the work that's going on and they'll describe what they have there. Let's clear that and well, I can't advance my slide now. Okay, stop sharing and then I can go back to sharing. Escape out of my difficulty, I hope. All right, here's the last day of the trip. More sites in Jerusalem. Oh yeah, I forgot. Also, day 7, we'll be going south to Bethlehem, to the Church of the Nativity, and the nearby Shepherd's Fields. I'm not sure how that's been commercialized, but I suspect it has been. All right, the last day of our trip, they usually save the last day of the trip, you know, at least for Christian visitors, to take the last days of Jesus. It's going to give a spiritual highlight to the tour. So we'll look at the upper room where Jesus, the traditional site, no proof, but traditional site for the upper room where Jesus had the Last Supper, Garden of Gethsemane where he was arrested. The Via Dolorosa I've marked with a red line here. It runs from along the north side of the Temple Mount, jog a few streets to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That is the traditional path that Jesus took from the scourging that he got in the Praetorium to where he was crucified. Now, modern archaeologists say, well, it's most likely that the Praetorium was actually close to the upper room. It was Herod's palace south of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre rather than east. But so the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, is not in its historical exact location. And certainly all the pavement is different anyway, but it is still a widely traveled tourist site. And people use different sites along it. There are different stations along the way, and people use these for devotional meditations. And when they use that, then it can be an effective devotional experience, even if it's not in the exact locations. Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then the other, that's where archaeologists think is most likely the real burial place or crucifixion place, and also another one that vies for authenticity is north of Jerusalem, called the Garden Tomb or Gordon's Calvary. So that's we'll also look at that. It has a better preservation of what a tomb actually looked like in those days. So that's an overview of what we are will be looking at over the next 8 weeks. Any comments or questions about that?
Will it be the same Zoom link?
Yes, same Zoom link all throughout the next 8 weeks.
Mike, will you be going to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, and the modern, the model of Jerusalem and the 2nd century temple?
No, I don't think so. I didn't see that on the itinerary. I mean, I know the model of Jerusalem is at the Israeli Museum or Museum of Israel. I forget the name.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't see that. And there's the Holocaust Museum, I think the Israel Museum, and it also has the location of some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's one of the great places that we won't be able to go to, unless there are some last minute changes, and that's possible too. But yeah, we wish we could go to more places, but we only have so much time.
Bring your virtual tickets.
All right. It's 8 o'clock already. Well, okay. Let's look at Tel Aviv, Joppa. Let's see, go back to share screen. Since we're not doing a lot on these days, we can go through this pretty quick. So I think, all right, we'll begin at Tel Aviv. We'll land at the airport, which is kind of closer to Tel Aviv than Jerusalem. This is Ben Gurion Airport, the busiest airport in the country. So I've got a couple pictures of that. Very modern airport. Now, Tel Aviv city is not a biblical city. It is the name of a place in Mesopotamia mentioned in Ezekiel 3. Ezekiel said, I came to the exiles who lived at Tel Aviv near the Kibar River in Mesopotamia. But so it's not the same city as what in the land of Israel. The name means hill of springtime. It means hill, but modern Tel Aviv is built on flat land. It's on the coastal plain. It was named after the title of a novel by Theodor Herzl, the father of the Zionist movement. It's the largest metropolitan area in Israel with about 4 million people, almost half the population of Israel. It's a beach city, sprawling for several miles along the Mediterranean coast. It began 1909 as a Jewish housing development on the northern outskirts of the Arabic city of Joppa. It grew rapidly in the 30s as European Jews moved into the area. And it has lots of buildings done in the German Bauhaus modernist style. This is the Bauhaus Museum. Tel Aviv is a center for diamonds, banking, embassy, technology companies, universities, and nightlife. The tourist guide says, we probably won't have time for the nightlife. Our hotel will probably be in the Tel Aviv area, but we really aren't going there to see the modern city. The official name of the city is Tel Aviv Yafo. Yafo is the Hebrew version of the Arabic word Jaffa, which is their name for the biblical city that we know as Joppa. Joppa plays a role in Old Testament history and in the New Testament. It's one of the few seacoast cities, one of the few ports in the country, even though it was small. So that's, as you can see on the map, most of Israel's coastline is a smooth curve. It's mostly sandy beaches. Only small boats can land on the beach. And the ancient Israelites were shepherds. They weren't sailors. They lived mainly in the mountainous areas. They had little experience with the sea. When King Solomon wanted to have a fleet of ships down south in the Gulf of Aqaba, he had to get the ships and the sailors from the king of Tyre. Those folks were seafaring, but the Israelites were not. They had only one word for a large body of water, whether it was fresh water or salt water. They didn't have words for gulf, inlet, bay, estuary, or lake. The only thing they had was the word for sea. And that's why the largest freshwater lake in Israel is called the Sea of Galilee. So most of the Israelites lived in the mountains, only a few were near the sea, and Joppa was one of the few natural harbors. The city of Joppa was on a small hill that stuck out in the Mediterranean a little bit. And there was a line of rocks offshore. You can see them in this picture that kind of gave the place a little bit of protection from the currents. So they had a place where small boats could be parked. And the port actually existed before the Israelites got there. Some call it the oldest seaport in the world. And this is what it looked like in 1839 when David Roberts traveled the area and made his paintings. And here is what the harbor looks like today. It's still just for small boats. The rocks offshore make it a dangerous place for big ships. And now Joppa, there's basically the old city of part of Tel Aviv Yafo. It dates back more than 3,000 years. It's mentioned a couple times in the Old Testament. 1 Chronicles 2 gives us a letter that Solomon sent to King Hiram of Tyre, asking him to supply some of the lumber that he needed to build a temple. Israel didn't have any tall trees, so they didn't have any long roof beams. These had to be imported from Lebanon. So King Hiram wrote back and said that he would do that. And in 2 Chronicles 2:16, we will cut all the logs from Lebanon that you need and we'll float them as rafts by sea down to Joppa. You can take them up from there to Jerusalem. And they had to drag those logs 40 miles uphill. Joppa is also mentioned in the book of Jonah. Chapter 1, verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to the Joppa, where he found a ship bound for Tarshish. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. See, God was telling Jonah to go preach to the city of Nineveh. That was the capital city of Assyria, one of Israel's big enemies. Jonah didn't want to preach to them because as he explains later in the book, he didn't want to warn them because if he did, they might repent and escape the danger. He didn't want to preach to Gentiles, so he tried to go in the opposite direction as far as he could. He went to Joppa to get on a ship going far to the west, Tarshish, what we now call Spain. The rest of the book tells how a large sea creature swallowed Jonah, brought him back to dry land, and Jonah told him again to go preach to Nineveh, and Jonah did. And just as he feared, those enemy people repented and escaped destruction. We don't know whether the great sea creature was a fish or a whale, but whatever it was, it got petrified and turned into a fountain in Joppa. Well, I think it's probably made of bronze. Joppa was again used as a port when they built the second temple. Ezra 3:7 gives the same story, that they brought down logs from Lebanon to the port city of Joppa to bring them up to the city of Jerusalem. Now, the next mention of Joppa it also involved preaching to Gentiles. That's the New Testament story of Peter. The story starts in Acts 9. In Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas. She was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time, she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydda, where Peter was near Joppa. So when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, please come at once. So to summarize, Peter came, Tabitha came back to life, a great miracle. Verse 42, this became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. And you can still see Simon's house on Google Maps. Well, that's the traditional location. The house itself isn't old enough to be the original, and it's actually a private home. It's not a tourist attraction. Well, while Peter was staying there, we read in chapter 10 that a Roman soldier in Caesarea had a vision. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, Cornelius. Cornelius stared at him in fear. What is it? He asked. The angel answered, your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa. That was about 2 days' journey, to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea. So Cornelius sends for Peter. Peter goes back to Caesarea, preaches to the Gentiles, and they become the first Gentile Christians. We'll visit Caesarea next week and continue that story. Today, we're just looking at Joppa. And our last stop on the tour today is the church that was built to commemorate this, the Church of St. Peter in Joppa. Very nice looking church. This is what it looks on the inside. And painting at the back or at the front of the church depicts an angel talking to Peter while he was on the roof of the house. It's interesting that the city was, in both Old Testament and the New, that had a role in God's work for the Gentiles. Although the Jews were not a seafaring people, they had this window open to the seacoast that enabled Gentiles to come to them, and that God used this city as a launching pad for them to go to the Gentiles. So that's our flying tour that we had today. Comments, questions?
It's nice to see the pictures without all of the tourists.
Well, we're going in winter. There might be fewer tourists for us. That might be one advantage. But whether perhaps because of COVID, or perhaps because of winter, so both of those might work in our favor in that regard.
I hope so.
Anybody else? All right. Well, we'll see you next week. when we look at Caesarea and points further north.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Bye. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay,
Thank
good
you.
night.
Very good. Thank you.